It was my first day back after summer break, and I'd already managed to do something completely embarrassing. I had knocked over an entire stack of books as soon as I entered the classroom, sending them scattering across the floor in a loud, echoing clatter. All eyes turned on me, and I could hear a few stifled laughs. I could feel my face turning red, making me wish I could melt right into my seat. I dropped my head low as I felt the side glances and heard the giggles. Right next to me, Jeremy, the king of cool, chuckled under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear.
Oh, Jill.
He smirked, leaning back on his chair with that careless ease.
You can't go a single day without doing something like this, huh?
The girls sitting around him burst into laughter, and he shot them a knowing grin. I kept my head down, cheeks flaming, feeling like the smallest person in the room. Jeremy was always the one getting attention, his blue eyes flashing with mischief as the other girls fawned over him. He knew exactly how to get a reaction out of everyone, and he didn't mind using me for entertainment. Then, just as I was sinking further into my seat, the door swung open and in walked Tyler. I barely dared to glance up, but when I did, I caught sight of his sharp, steady gaze and that quiet confidence he seemed to carry everywhere. Tyler had this steadying effect on people, as if no storm could touch him. He was a friend to both Jeremy and me, yet sometimes it felt like he was the only one who ever took me seriously. He scanned the room, his light brown eyes locking onto the little scene happening between Jeremy, the girls, and me. Without missing a beat, he walked over and stood right between us.
Enough, Jeremy.
His voice low and firm. Jeremy turned, giving him a lazy smile, trying to play it off.
Come on, Tay. It's just a joke.
But Tyler wasn't laughing. He stepped forward, his strong, tall frame casting a shadow over Jeremy and the giggling crowd around him.
I said enough.
Tyler repeated, his voice low and unwavering. His light brown eyes softened as he looked at me, and I could feel the tension ease in my chest.
Do you even feel a shred of shame mocking an orphan girl in your own class?
Tyler continued, looking around the room, and everyone went silent. But as the teacher droned on about the day's lesson, I could feel Jeremy's eyes on me again. He wasn't the type to let things go so easily. I glanced over, and he raised an eyebrow, flashing that teasing smile of his. Tyler and Jeremy were friends, close ones, but they couldn't be more different. Tyler was calm, collected, a steady presence who always seemed to know exactly what to say and when to say it. Jeremy, on the other hand, was all energy and fire, wild and unpredictable. And though they were close, there was always this strange, competitive edge between them. When the day finally ended, Tyler was looking at me with something unspoken in his gaze. Just as I was about to leave, he cleared his throat.
Jill?
He asked, his voice tentative, his fingers fiddling with each other, a habit he had when he was nervous. I turned back, my smile softening. Yeah? He took a step closer, barely meeting my eyes.
Do you want to go to a party tonight?
I hesitated, the offer hanging between us. Tyler had been the one constant in my life here, my only real friend. And something in his voice, a hint of vulnerability, made me want to say yes. So, I nodded. Okay, sure, let's do it. I headed home, feeling a strange mix of warmth from Tyler's kindness and the usual ache of loneliness. Being an orphan wasn't something I advertised, but it made home feel cold, even on warm days. My tiny apartment was empty as always, every room echoing a little too loudly with silence. I made myself a quick dinner, then settled on the balcony, scrolling mindlessly through Instagram. Then there was a knock at the door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. I jumped up and went to answer it. When I opened the door, I saw a stranger standing, tall and lean, muscular body, maybe around 30. His dark hair framed his sharp features. But what struck me most were his eyes, sea green, just like mine. They were intense, almost cold, and the longer I looked, the more unsettling they seemed. Yes, I managed, Unsure whether to feel nervous or plain creeped out, he smiled, a small, careful smile, and said,
Jill, I've been looking for you a long time. My name is Kellen. I'm your brother.
A wave of shock hit me. Brother? I stared at him, my mind reeling. As far as I knew, I had no family, no siblings, nobody. The idea that someone could just show up out of nowhere and claim they were my brother was absurd. I looked up at the man, and with a steady eyes I said, "That's impossible, I don't have a brother." Kellen's gaze didn't waver, and his expression softened, just enough that I wondered if he really believed what he was saying.
I know it sounds crazy,
He said,
but it's true. Our paths were separated a long time ago, but I've been looking for you ever since.
"Separated?" I echoed, still in disbelief. Why now? Why, after all this time? He took a deep breath, almost as if he was weighing how much to say.
It's a long story, Jill, and it's complicated.
Kellen sat across from me on the balcony, leaning back in his chair, his eyes lost in thought as he sipped his coffee. I could hardly believe this was real. My brother, or a man claiming to be, was sitting right here. Every glance, every slight smile, felt like a thread pulling me deeper into a world I thought I'd left behind. He set his coffee down, his gaze turning wistful.
You were always the quiet one, Jill. Careful, watching everything around you. I remember when you were little, and we'd play in the woods near our house. You'd always wear that white frock with the off-shoulder sleeves, the one with the little pearl buttons on the back.
I could see a drop of tear falling down his cheek. I blinked, startled by the detail. I could picture the frock now, hanging in the back of my wardrobe, almost forgotten. The memory surfaced slowly, like a faded photograph. Me, running through the trees, sunlight dancing on the fabric, a mix of laughter and adventure. No one else could have known that dress. That dress, I started, feeling the hair on my arms rise. It's still in my closet. He smiled gently, a warmth I hadn't expected lighting up his face.
I remember. I remember how you'd always get it dirty and try to hide it so Mum wouldn't see. But she always did.
It was like someone had opened a floodgate. His words stirred up more memories. The sensation of mud between my fingers, the thrill of running wild, of being just a child without the weight of loneliness that had crept into my life later. This stranger was slowly peeling away layers of my guarded heart, one memory at a time. "Why did you leave, Kellen? If you're my brother, where have you been all these years?" A shadow passed over his face.
It's complicated, Jill. But there's something you need to know. Something I couldn't tell you before.
He took a deep breath, his eyes darkening as if he was about to reveal something he'd carried alone for too long.
I'm a hybrid. Half werewolf, half vampire.
I stared at him, the words twisting in my mind, and a laugh escaped before I could hold it back. "You can't be serious. My parents were human. They were just normal,"
Yes,
he said quietly, his gaze steady.
our father was human. But our mother, she was a half werewolf.
I shook my head, trying to process this. "But that doesn't make sense. How did you end up a hybrid?" He leaned forward, his voice barely more than a whisper.
Jill, can I ask you something?
I looked up, surprised. Kellen was rarely unsure of himself. "Of course. What is it?" He paused for a while. Finally, he asked,
Do you know how our parents died?
I blinked, caught off guard. "In the car accident," I said, almost automatically. He shook his head, and something in his expression shifted, darker, heavier.
No, Jill. It wasn't a car accident.
My chest tightened. I set the coffee down, suddenly unsure if I wanted to hear whatever was coming next. Then what was it? His gaze dropped to the floor. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked.
It was me.
The words didn't register at first. I tilted my head, frowning. "What are you talking about?" Kellen's eyes met mine, and they were filled with a guilt so raw it made my stomach turn.
I wasn't always in control. When I was turned into a hybrid, the vampire instincts were stronger than me. Too strong. One night I lost control, and I ended up taking their life.
The world tilted. My ears rang as his words echoed, each one stabbing deeper. You're lying. My voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with disbelief. Please, Kellen, tell me you're lying. He reached out, but I flinched away.
I wish I were. I've lived with this every day, hating myself. But you needed to know the truth.
Anger boiled up inside me, hot and unforgiving. Before I could think, my hand flew across his face with a sharp slap. The sound echoed through the room, cutting through the rain. Get out! I shouted, standing up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. My hands were shaking. Get out and don't come back. Forget that you ever had a sister. Kellen didn't defend himself. He stood there, unmoving, the red mark on his cheek bright against his pale skin. His eyes glistened with tears he didn't bother to hide. He nodded slowly, his lips parting like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I turned away, unable to look at him. My chest was heaving, my breaths shallow. Every nerve in my body screamed for him to leave. When I heard the door close behind him, the dam broke. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. My tears soaked the sleeves of my dress, and I didn't even care. I just let it all out, the kind of crying that shakes you, makes your throat ache. But then, as if something snapped inside me, I remembered the promise I made to Tyler. I sniffed, wiped my face with trembling hands, and stood up. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone else. Puffy eyes, smudged makeup, a total mess. Pull it together, I whispered to myself. I washed my face, slipped into a red gown that I'd been saving for a special occasion. It clung to my curves, flowing down to my ankles in a soft shimmer of fabric, with just a hint of a slit up one side. My hair was loose, falling in thick waves down my shoulders. A quick swipe of eyeliner brought out the sea green of my eyes, and a London red lipstick tied it all together. When I caught my reflection, I barely recognized myself. I looked different, like I had stepped into a new version of myself. I just wanted to forget everything, even if it was only for a little while. When I arrived, the club pulsed with energy, the bass vibrating through the floor as neon lights flickered in rhythmic patterns. Tyler was sitting with Jeremy, each nursing a drink. I ignored Jeremy's glance, focusing on Tyler, whose eyes lingered on me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. He stood as I approached, his gaze never leaving mine.
You look amazing, Jill.
He said, his voice soft but warm. I felt my cheeks heat, but I managed a smile. Thanks. Jeremy's laugh broke the moment, and he smirked, looking me up and down.
Tonight, you don't look that bad.
He said, a smirk teasing his lips. His girlfriend was hanging off his arm, looking almost bored. I could tell he meant it as a compliment, however backhanded, so I ignored it. The music picked up, filling the room with a pulsing beat that made it impossible to sit still. Tyler held his hand out to me, a shy smile breaking through.
Wanna dance?
I nodded. Tyler and I moved to the dance floor, swaying to the rhythm as he pulled me close, his hands resting on my waist. He was gentle, yet firm, and I felt safe in his arms. Our movements synced naturally, and every time I looked up at him, I saw that familiar warmth in his eyes. But each time I looked away, my gaze met Jeremy's, glancing over me just a little too often.
You know, Jeremy, he can't keep his eyes off you tonight.
Tyler whispered in my ear. I chuckled, glancing over to see Jeremy laughing with his girlfriend, though his eyes still found their way back to me, time and time again. After a while, Jeremy and his girlfriend disappeared. Where did they go? I asked.
You know Jeremy. He's probably tucked away in some room with his girlfriend.
I felt Tyler's arm around me tighten, pulling me close to him. His gaze shifted and he looked as if he wanted to say something, his lips parting but no words coming out.
Jill,
He began, his voice soft, almost trembling.
there's something I need to say.
My heart raced as he hesitated. I tilted my head. "What is it, Ty?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tyler led me outside, away from the noise. Instead of answering, he pulled me close, pressing me gently against the wall. Before I could think, his lips were on mine, fierce and urgent. His hand cupped my face, his thumb tracing my cheek as he deepened the kiss, his tongue brushing against mine. I kissed him back, feeling a heat that drowned out every other thought. We melted into each other, the world fading away. A voice interrupted us.
Can I join?
I broke away, breathless, and saw Jeremy standing there, arms crossed, a mischievous grin on his face. Tyler shot him a hard look, his jaw tense.
Not funny, Jeremy.
Jeremy laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender.
Relax, man. I am just joking. Jill, she is not my type anyway.
He winked at me, his smirk lingering before he walked away, leaving us in silence. Tyler turned back to me, his hand still on my cheek, his eyes filled with something unspoken. We didn't need to say anything. The night had shifted, and we both felt it. Suddenly, the doors slammed open and they walked in. Vampires. Their eyes gleamed like polished coins under the dim lights. The crowd screamed, scattering like leaves in a storm. I froze, my feet rooted to the ground. Then, in a heartbeat, Tyler and Jeremy started to change. Their bodies twisted, their muscles rippled, and their clothes tore as fur sprouted along their arms and backs. My breath hitched. What the hell? They were werewolves? I stood there trembling like a leaf in the wind. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. Fangs, claws, growls. It was like being shoved into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from.
Jill, run!
Tyler shouted, his voice deeper, guttural. But I couldn't move. Before I could even scream, cold hands gripped me from behind, pulling me backward into a hard chest. The vampire's breath tickled my ear, icy and sharp. His hand slid over my chest, pulling me closer, and I felt the press of his fangs on my neck. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt like jelly, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Out of nowhere, I saw Kellen charging toward us. His face was fierce, his fists clenched. He swung hard, and the vampire released me, stumbling back. Kellen didn't stop. He punched, kicked, and tore into the creature with a strength I didn't know he had. Meanwhile, Tyler and Jeremy were fighting the others, their wolf forms a blur of fur and fury. The club was a war zone. Broken glass, overturned tables, and the smell of blood filled the air. When it was over, I was on the floor, clutching my neck, shaking uncontrollably. Kellen knelt beside me, his hand warm on my shoulder.
They know now, Jill. They know you're my sister. They'll come for you again.
I stared at him. Before I could respond, Tyler and Jeremy came closer, still in werewolf form, their eyes still blazing.
Are you okay?
Tyler asked, his voice low, full of concern. Kellen stood, and their gazes locked like two storms colliding. I could feel the tension in the air, and then they lunged at each other. "Stop it!" I screamed, stepping between them, my hands on Tyler's chest. His claws brushed my fingers, and I flinched, but I held firm.
He is our enemy.
Jeremy growled. They already knew each other? I wanted to collapse right there, but I forced myself to stay standing. My knees wobbled, my neck stung, and my head felt like it might explode. But somehow, I held it together. "He's my brother," I said, my voice cracking. Tyler and Jeremy froze, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. Kellen backed away, running a hand through his dark hair, his jaw tight.
You are not safe anymore. You should come with me, sister.
I crossed my arms, trying to steady myself against the weight of everything that had just happened. "And running away with you will magically fix everything?" His eyes flashed.
You don't know what they're capable of. Their leader.
His voice cracked, and for a moment I saw the pain behind his anger.
He's the one who turned me. He'll come for you because he knows what you mean to me.
he said, wiping the blood from my neck gently with his handkerchief. Tyler stepped forward then, his posture rigid.
She's not going anywhere with you.
Kellen rounded on him and then looked at me, his voice filled with pain.
You don't know anything, little sister. This Tyler, he is the alpha of the Crimson Moon Pack, and this Jeremy is the beta.
He spat the word, glaring at Jeremy.
They are just as much a threat to you as the vampires.
Jeremy bristled, his eyes blazing with fury, but he remained silent.
I've cared about Jill longer than you've been, Kellen. Don't talk to me about loyalty.
Tyler's words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken until now. Enough! I stepped between them, my voice trembling but firm. This isn't about who cares more. It's about what's right for me, and I'm not running. Not with you, not with anyone. Kellen's face fell, his shoulders slumping.
Jill.
I shook my head. No, I will stay at my home, and it is my final decision. Without another word, I grabbed my jacket and walked toward the door. Tyler and Jeremy exchanged a glance before following me outside. After we left the club and the chaos, both Jeremy and Tyler shifted back into their human forms. I was walking ahead of them when I turned around to say something, but my words caught in my throat. Both of them were completely bare. I quickly glanced at Tyler. His broad, muscular frame was striking, and before I could shift my gaze to Jeremy, I shut my eyes, not wanting to see him in this state. I handed Tyler a handkerchief without looking back. Jeremy teased,
Hey, what about me?
Sorry, I have nothing for you, I said, still keeping my eyes closed. Jeremy stepped in front of me, and I closed my eyes again. But before I did, I caught a brief glimpse of him. He, too, looked amazing, with his strong, muscular build. I sensed him pulling the jacket from my arm and teasingly said,
You should always carry extra clothes. You're the girlfriend of a werewolf after all.
His tone was playful, which made my mood lighten just a little. When we reached my house, Tyler finally broke the silence.
Jill, I didn't know Kellen was your brother.
I stopped on the porch, turning to face him. Neither did I, apparently. His eyes softened. He was about to reach me, but I raised a hand, stopping him mid-step. And what about you? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. When were you planning on telling me you were a werewolf, Tyler? Or were you just going to keep lying? He looked down, his jaw tightening.
It wasn't lying, it was...
Protecting me, right? I finished for him, my anger bubbling to the surface. That's the excuse everyone seems to use. Tyler didn't answer. Neither did Jeremy. Their gazes stayed glued to the ground. I sighed, pushing past them to unlock my door. You can both leave now. I'm fine on my own.
Jill, please.
Good night. Tyler started, but I cut him off. The house was cold and too quiet after they left. I lit a single candle on the kitchen counter, more for comfort than light, and leaned against the sink. My fingers brushed the fresh scar on my neck, and I flinched at the memory of the vampire's bite. Kellen had been there to save me this time, but what about next time? And the leader, what kind of creature could do that to his own kind, let alone to my brother? I poured a glass of water and stared out the window. The night felt endless. I tossed and turned, my mind spinning like an old scratched record stuck on a haunting tune. The truth about Kellen gnawed at me, the realization that he hadn't taken our parents. It was him, the leader of the vampires, the shadow behind every tragedy in my life. I stared at the ceiling, its familiar cracks somehow feeling foreign now, like everything else around me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kellen's face, twisted in pain as he told me his story. I saw the leader of the vampires too, though I had no idea what he looked like. In my mind, he was faceless, a dark void with sharp teeth. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling me. Tyler again.
Jill, are you okay?
His voice was soft, a little rough from sleep, but it held a tenderness that made my chest ache. I'm fine, Tyler, I whispered, though I wasn't.
You don't sound fine. Want me to come over?
No. I paused, feeling the weight of his concern. Thank you, but I need to figure things out.
Call me if you change your mind, okay?
I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I will. As soon as I hung up, the phone buzzed again. Jeremy this time. He didn't even wait for me to say hello.
Listen, Jill, I know you don't like me, but please tell me, are you okay?
He asked, concern lacing his words. Jeremy, I am fine.
Be careful, Jill, okay? And tell me whenever you need us. Don't hesitate.
Yeah, I will. I managed to say and hung up the call. Maybe he wasn't as bad as I had thought. The silence in the room felt thicker after that. By dawn, I had barely slept. I dragged myself to the window when I heard the sound of tires crunching on wet gravel. The sight outside was enough to wake me up fully. I looked out the window and saw a sleek black car with a royal crest on it. 2 men stood beside it, stone-faced and dressed in dark suits. This was new. Then I saw him. Kellen. He stepped out of the car with someone unfamiliar, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His outfit was effortlessly polished, a crisp white shirt under a tailored black blazer, paired with well-worn brown boots that added a rugged edge. His straight, slightly long hair framed his face. He had a kind of charm that was impossible to ignore. He was Marcus, the name I'd learned soon enough.
Good morning, sister.
Kellen greeted as I opened the door.
We're leaving for the fortress, now.
The fortress? I blinked at him. He shook his head, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Marcus followed, giving me a nod that was both polite and vaguely unsettling. I crossed my arms. I'm not going anywhere.
Jill.
Kellen's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it.
You're not safe here. Luca knows who you are now. You think I'd let him come for you? You're my sister.
He said, stepping closer.
I won't lose you too.
Marcus, who had been silent until now, spoke up. His voice was smooth but commanding.
Luca, the leader of the vampires, is powerful, Jill. He doesn't just kill, he destroys. You need protection, and Kellen can give you that.
I hated how logical they sounded. I hated that they were probably right. Without thinking, I started packing my bag, but Kellen waved it off with a chuckle.
No need for that. I've taken care of everything. Just bring your phone and anything you absolutely need.
It was strange, having someone care for all the details. I hadn't had anyone look after me in a long time. As we rode through winding forest roads, Kellen talked about how amazing the kingdom was. My curiosity got the best of me. Finally, we emerged from the dense forest, and in front of us stood a massive fortress, regal and ancient, yet somehow alive and vibrant. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, nestled in the heart of the woods, surrounded by greenery and mystery. Kellen opened the car door for me, taking my hand as we walked inside. Servants and guards greeted us with respectful nods, and everyone seemed to have a soft, welcoming smile as if they were genuinely glad to see me.
Welcome home.
He said, pushing open a grand wooden door.
This will be your room, little sister.
The room took my breath away. It was nothing short of royal, a canopy bed, delicate silks, every amenity I could imagine. It was almost too much to take in. Kellen's hand rested on my shoulder.
Get some rest. We have a meeting later.
He said with a kind smile before leaving me to explore. I sank into the warmth of the room, feeling a happiness I hadn't felt in a long time. I took my time, savoring each luxurious detail, the plush carpet underfoot, the ornate decorations, the fresh scent of lavender filling the room. After all the years of feeling like an outsider, I suddenly felt wanted. I unbuttoned my clothes and slipped into the large bathtub, sinking into the warmth, letting my worries drift away. When I finally got out, I noticed the dressing area was stocked with every makeup item and accessory I could dream of. I browsed through the wardrobe and found a stunning sky blue gown that seemed to call my name. I slipped it on, feeling an unfamiliar thrill. For the first time, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. As I finished getting ready, there was a soft knock at the door.
Jill, you ready, sister?
Kellen's voice was gentle. I opened the door to see him standing there, his eyes widening just a bit.
You look like the princess of this kingdom.
he said with pride, and I felt a warmth in my heart as we shared a smile. When we reached the meeting hall, whispers died down. All eyes turned to us. I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement, my pulse quickening. Kellen squeezed my hand reassuringly before addressing the room.
Everyone, this is my sister Jill, the princess of our kingdom.
The room erupted in applause and cheers, and I felt a blush creep onto my cheeks. It was surreal, standing there with so many people welcoming me. Kellen mentioned to Marcus.
From now on, you'll be responsible for taking Jill wherever she needs to go.
Kellen continued. Marcus was Kellen's right hand, a close friend and the commander of his army. Marcus nodded, offering me a friendly smile. Then, Kellen gestured to two women nearby.
Your task is to care for my sister's needs, whatever she wishes to eat, wear, or do.
I felt a strange sense of comfort, seeing how Kellen had thought of everything. For once, I forgot all my worries. I had people around me who wanted to protect me. Later, Kellen and I sat by a roaring fireplace, the warm glow casting shadows around the room. His expression grew serious as he talked about the kingdom and his plans.
We're at a point where we need more hybrids to battle with Luca. I want revenge from him,
he explained.
We're searching for a special girl who could be the key to our future.
Why hybrids? I asked, curiosity bubbling up.
Hybrids have unique powers, strength that ordinary werewolves and vampires don't possess. The more we have, the stronger our army will be. And soon, I'll find a suitable man for you, someone worthy. I'll see you wed into a life that keeps you close to me,
he said, giving me a soft smile. I forced a smile, but my heart belonged to Tyler now. Kellen knew that, yet he was still determined to find me a husband. He gave a reassuring smile before leaving, but as soon as he started to walk away, he stopped, turning back as if something important had slipped his mind.
Marcus will be the one to take you to school and pick you up,
he said, his tone firm but calm.
He's good at keeping people safe, and that's exactly what we need right now.
I met his gaze and gave a small nod, the weight of his words settling over me like an unspoken promise. But for now, I just wanted to enjoy this moment, the warmth of belonging and the thrill of something new unfolding around me. The next morning, the sleek royal car glided to a stop in front of the school, instantly turning every head in sight. Marcus stepped out first, his movements deliberate and commanding, like he owned the moment. He rounded the car with an easy grace. He pulled open the door for me, his hand brushing mine briefly as I slid into the seat. The contrast between Marcus and me was almost comical. I stood there, small and fragile, while he loomed large and broad, a towering presence that seemed to fill the entire space. As I stepped out, the air felt heavier with all the eyes on me. Whispers rippled through the crowd, curious stares locked on my dress, a soft cascade of expensive fabric, and the unmistakable elegance surrounding Marcus. His suit was sharp, dark as midnight and impeccably tailored, every inch of him exuding authority. I caught a glimpse of my classmates, the girls leaning into one another, their hushed gossip barely concealed as their eyes lingered a little too long on him. Marcus followed me, his presence as steady as a rock. His gaze swept over the courtyard as if scanning for unseen dangers. I barely had time to take a breath before I spotted Tyler and Jeremy. Both stood at a distance, their postures unusually tense. Jeremy wasn't surrounded by his usual gaggle of girlfriends, which was strange enough. I waved. "Hey!" I called, my voice softer than I intended. Relief washed over their faces as they turned to me. Tyler broke into a sprint, closing the distance between us before I could even process it. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. His scent, woodsy and warm, filled my senses, but the sheer intensity of his hug made my chest tighten.
Where were you yesterday? Do you even know how worried I was?
His voice cracked slightly, laced with raw concern. Before I could answer, Jeremy sauntered over, his usual smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He tapped me lightly on the head.
You're really bad at picking up calls, you know that? I almost thought Tyler would start crying.
His teasing tone barely masked the worry in his eyes. I tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. I'm sorry, okay? I meant to call back, but things got complicated. I could feel Marcus's gaze boring into us from a distance. When I turned, I caught him watching, his expression unreadable. It was as though he was trying to decipher my every movement, every interaction. It had been a few perfect days in this world I was slowly growing to love. Kellen had looked after me like no one else ever had. He was steady and protective. And Marcus, he was different, though equally watchful, always hovering nearby like a quiet shadow. Marcus had become something of a friend, even though he was around the same age as Kellen, about 9 or 10 years older than me. Sometimes I felt his gaze lingering on me, intense and unreadable, but I brushed it off. I was here for Tyler, my heart's home, and no one else could change that. Every night, I'd sneak in whispered conversations with Tyler, telling him about my new life here, about the strange, surreal ways everything had shifted. I miss you, I'd tell him, the ache in my chest always sharper by the end of our calls. Today after the class, Tyler grabbed my hand as the halls emptied and pulled me aside into a quiet corner. His green eyes were blazing. Without a word, he gently held me against a tree and shifted closer, his lips crashing onto mine with a hunger that surprised me. Filled with something fierce, it wasn't gentle, it was desperate, like he'd been holding this back for far too long. His hands slid down my shoulders, pulling the fabric of my blouse slightly aside as his lips traveled to my collarbone. I could barely think, the world narrowing down to the heat between us. Tyler, I started, but my voice was swallowed by another kiss, deeper this time. His hands roamed, possessive and urgent, as if he needed to stake his claim. My heart raced and I found myself leaning into him, surrendering to the moment. A voice interrupted us, laced with amusement.
You're acting like this is your first time falling in love, Tay.
Jeremy's voice, playful as ever, made my stomach drop. I turned sharply, heat rushing to my face.
Don't you have girlfriends to annoy?
Tyler snapped. His voice was low, simmering with frustration. But Jeremy's attention wasn't on him. His gaze fell on me, specifically my bare shoulder. I quickly adjusted my dress, my hands trembling as I tried to compose myself. Before Tyler could retort further, I saw Marcus coming, his face like a storm. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes burned with a fury I hadn't seen before. Without warning, he stormed forward and shoved Tyler back.
How dare you touch her?
His voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Before I could intervene, Jeremy stepped in, throwing the first punch. The sound of it echoed, a sickening crack that made my stomach churn. What happened next was pure chaos. Tyler and Jeremy began to shift, bones snapping, muscles rippling beneath their skin as they transformed into their wolf forms. Their claws extended, their eyes glowing with primal rage. Marcus didn't back down. His movements were swift, almost inhuman. He dodged Tyler's lunge and struck back with a ferocity that left me breathless. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The world seemed to tilt as the scene unfolded before me. "Stop it!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Please, stop fighting!" I threw myself between them, grabbing Tyler's arm. No, his claw. His wild eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw the boy I knew beneath the rage. Jeremy hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and Marcus. Slowly, they both stepped back, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Marcus's hand shot out, gripping mine tightly. Without a word, he pulled me toward the car. Tyler moved forward to shove Marcus, but Jeremy held him back, his strong arms restraining him. The car ride was silent. Marcus's jaw was still tight, his knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. I glanced at him, my heart aching at the sight of the bruise forming on his cheek. Tentatively, I reached out and touched his face. His skin was warm, rough beneath my fingers. He flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. He didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Before reaching the fortress, Marcus warned.
Don't breathe a word to Kellen about what happened at school. Tyler and Jeremy are our enemies. If he finds out, he'll put an end to your schooling.
That evening, as the house quieted and the shadows grew long, I hesitated for a moment outside his door, unsure if I should disturb him, but the memory of his bruised face and the guilt in my chest propelled me forward. I knocked softly.
Come in.
His voice called out, low and gravelly. I stepped inside, and my breath hitched. Marcus stood near the bed, shirtless, the dim light from the bedside lamp carving shadows across the muscles of his back. His broad shoulders were tense as he held a small mirror in one hand and dabbed at a wound on his chest with the other. His dark hair fell over his forehead, damp with sweat, as if he'd just come from battle. He glanced at me through the mirror, his amber eyes locking with mine.
Jill?
"Let me help," I murmured, reaching for the cloth in his hand. He sighed but relented, handing me the cloth. I dipped it into the bowl of water on the nightstand, wrung it out, and began gently cleaning the gash across his shoulder. He tensed at my touch, his gaze meeting mine with a startled intensity. The silence between us was thick. After a few moments, I murmured, "Thank you for not telling Kellen about Taylor and me." My fingers brushed over his skin and I felt him shiver, exhaling a deep breath he seemed to have been holding. There was a quiet intimacy between us, a warmth that lingered in the air, making it hard to ignore the way he looked at me, tracking every movement, every touch, and I could feel it. After everything was completed, I turned back to leave. His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist, not painfully, but firmly enough to send a spark up my arm.
Stay away from Tyler and Jeremy.
He said, his voice low and almost pleading. Before I could respond, my foot slipped on the edge of the rug, and I stumbled forward and landed against him, my palms splayed across his chest. His skin was feverishly warm, the ridges of muscle beneath my fingers taut. For a moment, neither of us moved. My cheek pressed against his shoulder. I could hear the rapid thudding of his heart beating too fast. His breath was shallow, each exhale brushing against the top of my head. But then his arms instinctively came up to steady me, firm and unwavering, offering support without crossing a line. Once I was balanced, he eased back, his hands falling to his sides. I pushed away quickly, my cheeks burning as I straightened my shirt. He stood there.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to grab you so hard.
His voice softened. I nodded quickly, eager to leave before I said, or did, something I couldn't take back. As I turned to go, I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and lingering. When I reached the hallway, I leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to my chest. My heart was still racing, and my skin tingled where he'd touched me. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Kellen's announcement earlier that evening had struck like a thunderclap, and now here I was, pacing in the dim candlelight, my heart pounding like a trapped bird in my chest. Marcus and I were to be married? I barely heard Kellen's footsteps as he entered my chamber. The wooden door creaked open, and his presence, as always, filled the space with a heavy, suffocating authority. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness underneath.
Sister,
He began, sitting on the edge of my writing desk.
the wedding is necessary. Marcus will keep you happier than anyone.
"No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I can't. I won't marry Marcus." He stepped closer, his fingers gently curling around mine. His voice was low, almost steady, but there was an edge to it.
You're too young to understand these things, little sister. You think love, this thing with Tyler, is going to protect you. He's not one of us. He's dangerous.
Before I could respond, the door opened again, this time with a slow, deliberate creak. Marcus stepped in, his presence shadowed yet commanding. His eyes filled with a kind of sadness I couldn't quite place, but tonight it felt heavier, as if it weighed down his every step.
What is it, my friend?
Curiosity lacing his words. Marcus hesitated, his eyes flickering to me briefly before he spoke.
We have found her.
He said quietly, his voice steady. Kellen straightened, excitement lighting his face.
Who is she?
He asked, nearly breathless.
Who's the human girl with blood that can make more hybrids?
Marcus looked at me, his eyes filled with an unbearable sadness, as if he held a truth that hurt him more than words could express. I felt a chill creep into my spine, dread pooling in my stomach as his silence stretched on. Kellen's smile wavered as he searched Marcus's face.
Marcus, what's wrong? Tell me, who is the girl?
Marcus swallowed, looking down briefly before his gaze returned to us. His voice was thick with pain.
It's your sister, Jill.
The word hit me like a physical blow. My knees almost buckled, and I clutched the edge of a chair to steady myself. Kellen's shock quickly turned into rage. His fist flew before I even realized what was happening, landing squarely on Marcus's jaw. Marcus didn't move, didn't even flinch, his face still calm and composed as if he'd expected this reaction.
You're lying.
His voice like thunder. Marcus shook his head, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth.
I'm not. Everyone knows about her now.
I tried to speak, but the words were stuck in my throat. My name echoed in my mind like a curse, each repetition hammering deeper into my heart. Kellen turned to me, his face twisted with pain and anger.
I didn't want this,
he said, his voice trembling.
but if you're the one, I'll have no choice. I will take revenge for our parents' deaths, even if it means caging you.
He declared, his voice trembling with anger. My breath hitched as he clapped his hands. 2 guards entered, their faces void of emotion, their steps purposeful.
Take her now. I can't bear to look at her like this. If I do, I'll shatter, and my revenge will remain incomplete.
He ordered, his words sharp and final. No! I shouted, stepping back instinctively. But Marcus moved before they could reach me. He stepped in front of me, his broad shoulders blocking their path.
She is my fiancée.
He said firmly, his voice low but commanding.
I will handle her.
Marcus placed a hand on Kellen's shoulder, his voice firm but gentle.
Kellen, listen to me. You don't need to worry. I'll make sure of it.
Marcus turned to me, his face unreadable. His voice was low and soft when he spoke.
Will you listen to me?
His eyes searched mine, pleading silently. I understood the hint. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, I will. For a moment, Kellen seemed to consider his words. Then, with a sharp nod, he said,
Fine, but the ritual will begin on the next full moon.
Kellen smiled at the exchange before leaving the room. The door closed, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. I let out a shaky breath, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. But before I could crumble, Marcus turned to me, his hands gently cupping my face, his touch grounding me in the moment.
Jill, listen carefully.
He said, his voice low and urgent.
Kellen doesn't trust easily. He'll come back to check. You need to make him believe you've changed your mind, that you're willing to marry me. It's the only way I can help you.
His eyes were filled with such raw concern that it was impossible to doubt him.
Will you do it? Tell me, Jill. Will you do it?
Yes, I whispered, my voice trembling. I could feel the weight of the decision settle over me like a heavy cloak. I closed my eyes for a moment, and Tyler's face flashed in my mind. I opened them again, the reality of our situation sinking in. There was no room for hesitation. If I didn't play along, Kellen would see through me, and Marcus's protection wouldn't be enough to save me. Before I could overthink it, I grabbed the front of Marcus's shirt and pulled him close. His eyes widened in surprise, but I didn't give him a chance to pull away. I pressed my lips to his, desperate and trembling. For a moment he hesitated, his eyes fixed on the floor, but then something shifted. His hesitation melted away, and his hands moved to my waist as he leaned, shifting closer. His lips were firm and urgent, and the space between us disappeared as his body pressed against mine. The heat of his touch sent shivers down my spine, and for a fleeting moment, the world around us faded. There was nothing but the fire between us, burning too bright and too fast. But then, Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Kellen standing in the doorway. He was watching us, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. The sight of him sent a wave of panic through me, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I tilted my head, deepening the kiss as if I was entirely lost in the moment. Eventually, Kellen turned and left. Relief flooded through me, but Marcus didn't seem to notice. His hands tightened on my waist, and I winced at the pressure. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice shaky. "He's gone." His movements stilled, and his eyes snapped to mine. For a moment, I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, something I wasn't sure I wanted to name. Then he nodded and took a step back, the distance between us suddenly feeling like a chasm.
I'm sorry.
He said quietly, his voice thick with something I couldn't place. I shook my head, my own emotions too tangled to make sense of. "It's fine. You did what you had to." But as we stood there, we both knew. Whatever had just happened between us, it was more than a performance, and the consequences were bound to follow.
We'll find a way out, okay?
He said, his deep voice steady, and with that he turned to leave. A wave of dread washed over me. The thought of being left alone tightened my chest. I couldn't bear to watch him walk away. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "Don't leave." He froze, his shoulders stiffening as if my words had struck him. Slowly he turned back, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, maybe even fear. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. But then he sighed, running a hand through his messy hair, the tension in his body softening just enough.
All right.
He said, his tone quiet but edged with reluctance.
But don't say I didn't warn you if I lose control.
"I won't." The words spilled out automatically. Marcus didn't respond right away. He stepped back toward the bed, his movements slow, deliberate. He sat down, the mattress creaking softly beneath his weight. Reaching down, he unhooked his brown boots and set them aside, his motions fluid but careful. Then, with a quiet exhale, he unbuttoned his black coat and shrugged it off. His fitted white shirt clung to his broad frame, and as he undid the top 3 buttons, the faintest glint of moonlight brushed across his collarbone. He leaned back against the headboard, his shoulders sinking into the worn wood as if he were finally letting himself rest, even just a little. I couldn't look away. My eyes traced every inch of him, from the way his shirt clung to his chest to the way his shoulders relaxed against the headboard. There was something about him, something unspoken, that held me captive. It wasn't just his presence. It was the quiet vulnerability beneath it. When he noticed my lingering stare, a faint flush crept up his neck, softening the sharp lines of his face. For a moment, he looked almost shy. He shifted slightly, clearing his throat as if trying to shake off the weight of my gaze. But I was already caught.
Come, take your place.
The words, simple as they were, pulled me out of my trance. My heart thudded against my ribs. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground, but the warmth in his gaze, the quiet strength in his voice drew me forward. Slowly, I climbed onto the bed, the mattress dipping under my weight. The silence between us was thick, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire in the corner. I lay stiffly on my side, my back to him, every nerve in my body on edge. I knew Marcus felt it too. His breaths were slow but heavy, the kind that came from someone trying to hold back. I kept tossing and turning, the bed feeling too small for the storm raging inside me. The weight of it all, Kellen's sudden shift, his confession, pressed down on my chest like a stone. He had been my brother, my protector, the one I trusted most. Now, he was a stranger.
Jill.
He murmured softly, his voice cutting through the darkness. I felt his hand search for mine, his touch warm and sure, despite the tension in the room. Without thinking, I turned to him, pressing my head against his chest. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat felt like the only solid thing in my world. I have no one to trust now, Marcus, I whispered, my voice breaking. Except for you. His hand moved hesitantly to my hair, his fingers threading through it with a tenderness that caught me off guard. He was careful, almost as if he was afraid of breaking me further.
I'll help you, Jill.
He whispered, so quietly it felt like a promise meant only for me.
Trust me. By morning, I'll figure out a way, but for now, you need to take rest.
His fingers gliding through my hair in slow, gentle motion. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and sleep claimed me. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the first thing I noticed was Marcus. He was still in the same position, his head resting against the headboard, his eyes fixed on the far wall. You didn't sleep, I said, my voice raspy with sleep and concern. His gaze shifted to mine, a faint smile tugging at his lips.
I'm fine. You needed the rest more than I did.
The tenderness in his words made my chest ache. He had stayed awake all night. For me. I sat up slowly, the weight of his sacrifice sinking in. As I moved, he stretched, his joints cracking slightly. His movements were unhurried, deliberate.
Jill,
He said, his tone serious now.
I need to tell you something. I'm a hybrid, part vampire, part human. It's why I can protect you the way I do.
He paused, his eyes meeting mine.
I can turn you into a vampire if you want. It would make you stronger, able to defend yourself.
My stomach churned at the thought. Memories flooded back to Luca, the king of vampire who had taken everything from me. I hate vampires, Marcus, I said, my voice trembling but firm. They took my whole family. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he nodded.
I understand.
As Marcus drove me to school, my mind still buzzed with everything that had happened, and my heart ached with the weight of the choices I was being forced to make. We passed the school gates, and near the lockers, I spotted Tyler and Jeremy. Tyler was leaning against a locker, scanning the crowd with his usual calm intensity. Jeremy, on the other hand, was animated, gesturing wildly as he spoke. I took a deep breath and walked up to them. Tyler, can I talk to you? He raised an eyebrow but didn't hesitate.
Sure, but maybe ask your bodyguard here to stand down this time. I'm not in the mood for another round.
Come on, he's not my bodyguard, I said with an exasperated huff, rolling my eyes for effect. Before Tyler could retort, I grabbed his arm and started pushing him toward the auditorium. Jeremy followed us, and Marcus already stood there leaning against the wall with crossed arms, his sharp jawline and easy smirk barely concealing the tension in his body. I'm the girl my brother is searching for, I said, my voice steady, despite the weight of the words. Tyler's eyes widened, his shock evident as he turned to Jeremy, who stood just a step behind him. It was like time slowed for a second, and in that pause the reality of my situation seemed to press in on me from all sides. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but I beat him to it. I need your help, Tyler, I said, my voice rising with desperation. Please turn me into a werewolf for my own protection. I can't survive this war without the power. I need to be strong. He froze for a moment, his jaw tightening.
I can't do that, Jill.
The words hit harder than I expected, and before I could react, Jeremy stepped forward, frustration clouding his features.
Why can't you? Because you can't love her if she becomes one of us, is that it?
I looked between the two of them, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling between us all. Tyler's reluctance was clear, but why? The answer seemed to sit just beneath the surface, teasing, but elusive. Tyler, I need to tell you more, I said, looking into his eyes. I hesitated, glancing at Marcus, who was still leaning against the wall, watching silently. His dark eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like appreciation in them. I kissed Marcus, I said finally, my voice trembling, to prove to Kellen that I'm ready to marry him, and we spent the night in the same room. Tyler's reaction was instant. His eyes darted to Marcus, then back to me, burning with anger. In 2 quick strides, he closed the distance, his hands gripping my arms tightly.
How could you do that?
He hissed, his voice low and trembling with fury.
Is that all, or are you lying to me?
The tension in his grip grew with each word, his fingers digging into my skin as if trying to pull the truth from me. His eyes, usually so warm, were sharp now, cutting through me like a blade. But I forced myself to hold his gaze. "I'm not hiding anything," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I told you because you deserve to know the truth." Marcus finally pushed off the wall, stepping between us,
That's enough.
his voice calm but firm. Jeremy moved too, shoving Tyler back.
You're such a hypocrite.
He snapped.
She's standing here confessing everything, and you've never told her the truth about your past.
My head snapped to Jeremy. "What is he talking about?" Jeremy opened his mouth to speak, but Tyler silenced him with a hard glare. Jeremy rolled his eyes.
If he won't help you, I will.
He said, turning to me.
Tell me what I need to do.
Before I could respond, Marcus stepped in.
I know a witch.
He said, his voice calm but commanding.
She can make your bite more powerful, Jeremy. When you turn Jill, she'll be one of the strongest werewolves we've ever seen.
Jeremy nodded, his expression serious for once.
Let's go.
Marcus said, glancing at me and Jeremy before grabbing my hand. His touch was warm and steady, grounding me in the chaos. We started to walk away, leaving Tyler behind. As Marcus drove us through the winding roads of the forest, I sat in the front seat. I glanced at Jeremy in the back seat through the rearview mirror. He was slouched, his usual cocky grin replaced by a pensive look. "Jeremy," I began cautiously, breaking the silence that had stretched too thin. What did Tyler hide from me? Jeremy's lips curled into a bitter smile, his eyes reflecting something between pain and regret. He hesitated for a moment before leaning forward, his voice low and deliberate.
It was years ago.
He started, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them against a cold memory.
Back when Tyler and I, we fell in love with the same woman.
I frowned, confused. "What woman?"
She was older than us.
He continued, his tone softer now.
Beautiful, fierce. She already had a child from another man, but that didn't stop us. We were both madly in love with her.
The weight of his words settled in the car, and even Marcus glanced sideways at him briefly, his brow furrowed. "What happened?" I asked, unable to mask my curiosity. Jeremy let out a dry laugh, shaking his head.
When we asked her who she loved, she said, "I love both of you."
He sighed deeply.
And we were so blinded by her charm we didn't even care. We decided she could have both of us. One night with me, another with Tyler.
Marcus and I exchanged a quick glance, unspoken thoughts passing between us. My stomach tightened. "Jeremy, that doesn't sound like love to me,"
I know.
he admitted, his voice breaking slightly.
At least I figured it out later. I couldn't force her into anything. I stayed sober about it, told her she didn't owe me anything. But Tyler? He was different. He wanted her love at any cost.
Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles whitening, but he said nothing. Jeremy leaned back, staring out of the window now.
One night, when they were together, Tyler bit her. He turned her into a werewolf, hoping she'd love him and only him after that.
I gasped, horrified. "What? He turned her without her consent?" Jeremy nodded grimly.
He thought it would bond them forever, but it didn't. She ran off with an alpha from another pack instead. Left Tyler, left me, left her kid behind. Tyler moved on, or at least he pretends he has. Me?
He chuckled darkly.
I'm still carrying that weight. That's why I go through girlfriends like they're nothing. They're just distractions.
The car fell into silence again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. My thoughts spun wildly. "Is that why Tyler doesn't want me to become a werewolf?" I asked softly.
Yes.
"Where is she now?" The question trembling between curiosity and dread. Jeremy hesitated, his eyes darting down. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air.
I'm not in contact with her anymore. Neither I want to be.
He admitted, his tone heavy with something that sounded like regret.
But
He added, his gaze lifting to meet mine, sharp and deliberate.
Tyler is.
The words hit me like a slap. What? Jeremy continued, his voice hardening.
He's been talking to her. He's been in contact with her all this time, and he's been hiding it from you since the beginning.
I felt my knees weaken, my mind spinning.
Then why is he with Jill?
Marcus snapped, his voice sharp with barely contained anger.
Because Tyler thinks she's too naive to ever see his true colors.
Jeremy replied coldly. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, his brows frowning as they flicked to me.
Wow. What a noble use of someone's innocence.
He said, his tone dripping anger and worry. Ahead of us was a small stone cottage, covered in moss and illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight breaking through the trees.
We're here.
Marcus announced, his voice firm. I stepped out of the car, the chill biting at my skin. Jeremy followed, shoving his hands into his pockets. I glanced at him, still trying to process everything he'd told me. The small wooden cottage of the witch was lit by warm candlelight, and the scent of herbs and something faintly sweet lingered in the air. She stood in the center of the room, her presence serene yet commanding. Her silver hair fell in waves over her shoulders, her eyes piercing yet kind, as though she could see straight through me.
"Come closer,"
she said, her voice like a soft melody.
"You've come for the spell."
Marcus and Jeremy exchanged a look, and I felt the weight of their unspoken words. Slowly, I stepped forward. The witch turned her gaze to me, her smile gentle but filled with a wisdom that made me uneasy.
"I can spell your bite, but it comes with a cost."
What cost? I asked, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. Her eyes held mine, unwavering.
"You will feel a sudden pull toward the man who bites you. You will surrender to him completely, fall in love with him, and he will be the only one you obey when you are in your werewolf form. You will do everything to please him."
I felt my stomach twist as her words sank in. But then she continued, her tone grave.
"There's one more condition. You'll forget everything any man who's ever loved you has done for you. Every act of care, every sacrifice, all of it."
The room seemed to freeze. Beside me, Marcus let out a sharp breath. I turned to see him stumble slightly, catching himself on the wall for support. "Marcus," I whispered. My hand shot up instinctively to steady him. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. He gave a quick nod, though his unsteady breathing told a different story. Jeremy's gaze snapped to Marcus, suspicion flickering across his face.
Marcus, what's wrong?
He asked, his tone sharp, almost accusatory.
Don't you trust me enough to take care of Jill?
Marcus straightened.
It's not what you think, Jeremy.
Jeremy turned to me uncomfortably, his gaze steady but uncertain.
Jill, I promise, I'll keep you safe, always.
Marcus's expression hardened as though he'd forced his emotions behind a wall.
Do it. Do it now.
He said, his voice low but firm. A tear slipped down his cheek as he spoke, and my heart clenched. He turned away before I could say anything, his broad shoulders stiff with tension. Jeremy's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between Marcus and me, but he said nothing. The witch watched us silently. She motioned for Jeremy to step forward, handing him a vial filled with a shimmering red liquid.
"Drink this,"
she instructed. I glanced at Jeremy. He was so different from Marcus. Where Marcus was stoic and guarded, Jeremy wore his emotions on his sleeve. He looked younger, softer. Marcus had been my anchor through everything, and Jeremy, he'd been my friend for so long, but now everything felt so much more complicated. Jeremy hesitated, glancing at me one last time before uncorking the vial and downing it in one quick gulp. He winced as the magic coursed through him, his body trembling for a moment before he steadied himself.
"It's done,"
the witch said, her tone cold and final. As we turned to leave, the weight of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy cloak. My legs felt like they might give out, but Marcus was suddenly there, his hand holding mine. The witch caught my arm as I passed her. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her touch icy. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper only I could hear.
"Marcus loves you, unconditionally."
she said, her tone almost gentle. The truth of her words cut deeper than I ever expected, stirring something in me. As we reached the fortress, Marcus turned to me suddenly and said,
Come with me.
He led me through winding hallways until we reached his room, a place I'd only glimpsed from the doorway before. Marcus guided me to a small couch by the window and gestured for me to sit. I obeyed. He knelt on the floor in front of me and pulled a small jewelry box from his pocket. My breath caught as he opened it. Inside was a ring, a delicate silver band with an intricate design and a tiny carving of the letter M. It's beautiful, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Marcus looked up at me, his blue eyes filled with something raw and unspoken.
I ordered it for you a long time ago,
He said quietly.
before all of this.
He reached for my hand, sliding the ring onto my finger with a tenderness that made my chest ache.
I want you to be my fiancé tonight, just for tonight. Will you?
His voice cracked. Yes, I said instantly, my throat tightening as I answered. The witch's warning echoed in my mind, a cruel promise that I would forget every love ever given to me by any man. Marcus's hand gently cupped my face, his touch warm yet trembling. His eyes searched mine, filled with a raw pain that made my chest tighten.
Give me something to remember.
He whispered. Without breaking eye contact, he reached for a piece of fabric from the nearby table, his movements slow, almost hesitant. When he turned back to me, his expression was a storm of heartbreak and longing. He gently tied the fabric around my eyes, plunging me into darkness. The air between us shifted, growing charged with something raw and electric. His lips found mine. The kiss was soft at first, a hesitant brush of warmth that sent shivers down my spine. But it quickly deepened, becoming urgent and fierce. I gasped for air and he pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine.
Breathe.
He whispered, his breath warm against my skin. He kissed me again, this time slower but no less intense. His hands moved to my shoulders, sliding the fabric of my dress down inch by inch. His lips followed, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. I felt my heart racing, my skin tingling under his touch. Blindfolded, I could only sense him, the heat of his body, the roughness of his calloused hands, the way his breath hitched when I touched him. I lifted my hands, trying to find him, and he guided them to his face. My fingers traced his jawline, his cheekbones, the soft curve of his lips. I reached for the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the buttons in a frantic rush.
Jill, slowly.
He murmured, his hands gently covering mine, steadying me. His voice was soft, patient, as if he could feel the weight of my nervousness, his touch guiding mine until the fabric fell open. My hands drifted hesitantly over the hard planes of his chest, his heartbeat strong beneath my palm. He lifted me in his arms, carrying me to the bed. My blindfold slipped slightly as he set me down, but I didn't open my eyes. I didn't want to. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, pulling me onto his lap.
Tell me, Jill, are you comfortable?
He asked, his voice full of concern. Yes, I'm fine, Marcus, I whispered, offering a reassuring smile. He took a deep breath, his hands settling firmly on my waist, and I could feel the tension in his body as he moved against me. He removed the blindfold, gently, and when our eyes met, there was a hint of shyness and concern in his gaze.
Jill, I need to know you're okay. I don't want to push too far. You mean too much to me.
He said softly, his hand brushing my shoulder. I smiled, pressing my lips to his, my fingers tangling in his hair. He responded with a ferocity that left me breathless, his hands sliding up my back, drawing me closer until there was no space left between us.
I love you, Jill,
he confessed, as the exhaustion took over us, pressing a soft kiss on my forehead. All I could do was cradle his face in my hands, letting my touch speak the emotions I couldn't yet put into words. The night passed slowly, every moment spent reliving the memories Marcus and I had shared. His deep voice filled the silence, recounting stories which I will forget tomorrow. It wasn't until the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains that Marcus spoke of what was to come.
I'll make sure it's not painful.
He said softly, kneeling in front of me as he tied the laces of my shoes. I watched his hands, strong, steady, yet oddly gentle, moving with care. When we reached Jeremy's house, Marcus parked the car and got out, his movements precise but tense. He came around to my side, opened the door and held out his hand. He held my hand tightly, his warmth steadying me as we approached the door. Jeremy opened it with his usual swagger, his green eyes sharp and calculating. His gaze flickered to Marcus, then to our joined hands, and I didn't miss the flicker of irritation that passed over Jeremy's face.
Come in, Jill. Marcus.
Jeremy said, inviting us.
Are you ready?
Jeremy asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. I nodded, even though my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. Jeremy stepped closer, his eyes softening as they met mine. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my shoulder as he slid the fabric of my shirt aside. I felt the cool air on my skin, and instinctively, my grip on Marcus's hand tightened. I could feel Marcus stiffen beside me. His breathing slowed, controlled, but his eyes were burning as they shifted toward the window, away from Jeremy and me. Jeremy's hands moved to my back, steady and deliberate, and his fangs began to lengthen.
It'll be over soon, okay?
Jeremy murmured, and then he pulled me closer, his grip firm as his fangs pierced my neck. The pain was sharp, searing, and I squeezed my eyes shut, clinging to the last remnants of my memories. Marcus's voice, his laughter, his quiet moments of care, all of it blurred, slipping through my fingers like sand. And then there was nothing, just a void. I felt something new, a pull, an unrelenting connection to Jeremy. My body tingled with an unfamiliar warmth, and when my eyes opened, everything looked different, sharper, brighter. Jeremy stood in front of me, his hand still resting lightly on my back. I felt safe with him, drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. I reached out, my arms wrapping around him instinctively. Behind me, Marcus's voice broke the silence.
Jill?
I turned slightly, glancing at him over my shoulder. His face was unreadable, but his eyes looked shattered.
Do you remember me?
He asked, his voice rough. Something flickered in my chest, faint but persistent. I smiled softly. Of course, Marcus. Relief washed over his face, softening the hard lines that had formed there. As we left Jeremy's house, Marcus walked beside me. His hand brushed against mine, and without thinking, he took it in his. In that moment, everything felt wrong. My mind was clouded with an overwhelming sense of loyalty to Jeremy, and a wave of frustration began to bubble up inside me. Marcus, I said, stopping in my tracks. I can walk on my own. He nodded, his face unreadable, and slowly let go of my hand. We walked in silence towards the car. The engine hummed softly as Marcus drove through the winding forest road. He glanced at me briefly, his voice low.
What's the last thing you remember with me, Jill?
I closed my eyes, trying to piece together the fragmented memories. They came like flashes, moments that felt more like dreams than reality. I remembered a promise, one spoken in the dark, filled with fear and longing. I promised you, I said slowly, that I would obey you. It was the night Kellen tried to cage me. The faintest smile graced Marcus's lips, soft and fleeting. Lately, Jeremy had been occupying my thoughts. He was charming in his own way. Green eyes that sparkled with mischief, a smile that promised secrets, and a voice that could coax even the most guarded heart to open. We had started talking over the phone for hours, sharing stories and ideas about the world we were both part of now. We met often, yet every time I saw Marcus, a strange pull would tug at my chest, an unexplainable connection I couldn't shake. Tonight was different, though. The air felt charged, the kind of night where anything could happen. Marcus came to my room as the sun dipped below the horizon, the light from the full moon spilling through the window. His presence filled the space, commanding and yet comforting.
It's the full moon tonight. Jill, you know what you have to do.
I crossed my arm. I do. Don't worry, Marcus. I'll do it.
You know I'll always be here for you, right?
His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out toward me. But I took a step back. Marcus, stop it, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Why are you treating me like a child? Like I don't understand anything. I can handle this. I can handle things. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze searching mine as if he could find the answers he desperately needed. And then, without a word, he turned and left, the silence lingering long after the door closed behind him. Not long after, Kellen arrived, his lips curving into a predatory grin.
Full moon tonight, little sister.
He said.
We're going to turn more hybrids tonight. Strength in numbers, Jill. You understand that, don't you?
I didn't reply. I only smiled and nodded. Kellen's plans were ambitious, and so was mine. As the moon rose higher, I stood outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin. Marcus appeared again, his expression unexpectedly light, as if the scolding from a few hours ago had never happened. He seemed completely unfazed, calm, almost cheerful, like he was in an even better mood than before.
Tell me, what's your plan, princess?
He asked casually, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. I studied him for a moment, marveling at his composure. How could anyone remain so unshaken after being rebuked? Despite myself, a small smile crept onto my face. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm going to play Kellen's game, I began, meeting Marcus's gaze. He needs a witch and me to complete the ritual. Once he starts the sacrifice, I'll transform into a werewolf. It'll catch him off guard. That's when I'll fight. Marcus's brows furrowed in surprise.
Wait, you're going to let him think he's won?
I nodded. Yes. He'll think I'm helpless, that I'm already defeated. But when I shift, when I fight, it'll change everything. His eyes softened for a brief moment. He was impressed, but I could also see the concern lurking there.
And then what?
Then, you'll see, I said with a slight smirk. You'll watch me take him down. He chuckled softly.
All right, Jill, what's my role in this grand plan of yours?
I turned to face him, meeting his gaze. Your duty is simple. Watch me defeat Kellen. His smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of something I couldn't name.
That's it? Just stand by and watch?
That's it, I said, nodding. He sighed, running a hand through his hair.
Fine. But have you called Jeremy?
Yes. Marcus gave a faint nod, but his eyes darkened, the jealousy clear in them even if he wouldn't say it aloud.
All right then. I'll see you later,
he said, turning on his heel. I watched him leave, the weight of his reaction settling heavily in my chest. Why did it bother me so much? My eyes drifted to the silver ring on my finger, the delicate M carved into its surface catching the light. When had I started wearing this? I couldn't remember. It was beautiful, though, its cool metal snug on my ring finger. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to take it off. Later that night, Kellen arrived with his men. He was dressed in black, his tall frame imposing under the moonlight. His dark hair was slicked back, and his piercing black eyes seemed to burn with a mix of excitement and sadness.
Little sister,
he said, his voice almost tender as he hugged me.
Revenge is the only thing that matters. Sacrificing you will be worth it.
His words stung, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't going to let him see my fear.
Chain her,
Kellen ordered, stepping back. Before his men could grab me, Marcus stormed into the room, his voice sharp as a blade.
Stop it.
All eyes turned to him. Marcus's tall, broad frame filled the doorway, his blue eyes blazing with fury.
She'll walk on her own,
he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kellen narrowed his eyes but gave a slight nod.
Fine. Let her walk.
As we began the climb up the hill, Marcus's hand found mine. His grip was firm, unyielding. I tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. "Marcus," I hissed, "let go."
No.
He said simply, his eyes forward. I sighed, giving up the struggle. His hand was warm, grounding me in a way I didn't want to admit. The hill stretched before us, the wind biting at my skin. Kellen walked ahead, his men flanking him, their faces blank and focused. Marcus stayed close to me, his presence a quiet rebellion against the inevitability of the night.
Don't forget to transform.
Marcus teased, a playful glint in his eyes. A soft laugh escaped me before I could stop it. As we reached the ritual site, Marcus turned to me, his grip on my hands tightening.
Jill?
He said softly, his voice laced with worry. His eyes searched mine, filled with a concern I wasn't sure I could handle. "Stop worrying about me every second, do you hear me? Jeremy is coming to help," I said, trying to sound firm, though my heart was pounding in my chest.
Yeah, I get it.
He replied, but there was something in his tone, a mix of frustration and sadness that stung more than I expected. Before I could say more, his hand slipped away from mine, so subtle I barely noticed. I glanced around, taking in the eerie stillness of the place. The witch stood in the center of the circle, her tattered black robe swaying in the cool midnight breeze. Around her, candles burned low, their flickering light casting long, eerie shadows. She clutched an ancient spellbook in one hand, her other hand tightly gripping Kellen's. The moon hung high, bathing the scene in silver. I stood at the edge of the ritual site, my heart pounding in anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment everything would change. The witch began to chant, her voice low and gravelly, weaving words of power through the night air. Kellen's eyes were locked on me, cold and calculating. He thought he had won, but I knew better. Minutes passed. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Then the witch's chanting faltered. She frowned, flipping hurriedly through the spellbook.
"It's not working,"
she muttered. Kellen's jaw tightened.
That's impossible. Do it again.
The witch tried, her voice rising in desperation, but again nothing happened. Kellen snapped, standing abruptly. His frustration burned in his dark eyes as he turned to me.
What have you done, Jill?
I didn't answer. I was waiting for the perfect moment. He stormed toward me, his footsteps heavy, but before he could reach me, I let the beast inside me take over. My body convulsed, and I fell to my knees, the transformation ripping through me like a storm. Fur sprouted from my skin, claws extended from my fingers, and a feral growl escaped my lips as I rose, a towering, massive werewolf. Gasps filled the air. Kellen froze, his anger replaced with shock. I lunged at him, my claws slicing through the air. He barely managed to dodge, but I was faster, stronger. I knocked him to the ground, pinning him under my massive paw.
Jill, no.
Marcus's voice cut through the chaos. I caught a glimpse of him standing at the edge of the circle, his eyes wide with shock and admiration. But I couldn't focus on him. My rage consumed me. I grabbed Kellen by the neck, my claws tightening. He struggled beneath me, his face pale, his breaths coming in short gasps.
Let him live, Jill.
Marcus shouted, stepping closer. I growled, warning him to stay back, but he didn't listen. When he got too close, I picked him up by the collar and threw him to the ground. "Stay out of this!" I snarled, my voice guttural and wild.
Jill, no!
Jeremy's voice broke through my haze. I turned to see him standing there, his face pale but determined. His words reached a part of me that still remembered who I was. My breath came in heavy pants as I loosened my grip on Kellen. "Tell me, brother," I growled, my voice low and menacing. "Where do you want to stay? Prison or heaven?"
I'm sorry, little sister, please.
I nodded to his men. "Chain him." To my surprise, they obeyed without hesitation. They weren't Kellen's men anymore. They were mine. I had won. I had defeated the king and claimed my place as queen. The crowd erupted into cheers, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the roar of blood still rushing in my ears. My rage wasn't gone. It still burned hot, threatening to consume me. Jeremy stepped forward, his hands steady as he reached for me. His arms wrapped around my massive form, pulling me close. His warmth soothed the fire inside me, and slowly, I began to change back. Fur gave way to skin, claws to fingers, and the beast retreated. As the last remnants of my transformation faded, Jeremy cupped my face, his blue eyes soft with relief. He kissed me, his lips firm and reassuring. I leaned into him, letting the chaos of the night melt away for a moment. He deepened the kiss, his hand sliding to my waist, anchoring me. His other hand worked quickly, unbuttoning his shirt. Before I was fully human again, he wrapped it around me, shielding me from the cool night air.
You did it, Jill.
He whispered against my lips, his voice filled with pride. I smiled faintly, resting my forehead against his. We turned to leave, heading back toward the fortress, but a pang of guilt shot through me. My gaze shifted to where Marcus still lay on the ground, struggling to rise. His eyes were on us, his expression unreadable, though the hurt was clear in the tight line of his jaw. "Marcus," I whispered, my heart sinking. I let go of Jeremy and ran to him, kneeling at his side. His shirt was torn, his face streaked with dirt, but his pride was the most wounded thing about him.
I don't need your help, Jill.
He said stiffly, brushing my hand away as I tried to steady him. "I'll be fine." "Marcus, I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking.
Are you?
He asked, his tone cutting. Jeremy stood a few feet away, his posture tense, his jaw clenched. I could feel his frustration, but I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest as I looked at Marcus. I wasn't myself, I tried to explain. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin, tight line. With visible effort, he pushed himself to his feet, brushing off the dust clinging to his shirt. His hazel eyes met mine, a storm of anger and something deeper swirling in their depths.
You don't owe me an explanation, Jill. It's fine.
His voice was sharp, clipped, like a blade cutting through the tension. Then he paused, his jaw tightening before he added,
Tell me, do you want me to stay in the fortress or should I leave?
The question hit me like a slap. "Marcus, what are you even saying? Why would you think you can't stay? This is your home too. Of course you should stay," I said, stepping closer, my voice softer now. His eyes darkened, a bitter smile twisting his lips.
Oh, thank you for the kindness, Your Majesty.
His voice dripping with sarcasm.
How generous of you to grant me permission to exist in the place I built with my own blood and sweat.
I flinched, his words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. The anger in his tone wasn't just about tonight. It was a wound that had been festering for much longer.
Jill, if you're done with Marcus, we can head to the fortress.
Jeremy's voice rang out from behind us, sharp and impatient. I turned to glance at him, his arms crossed over his chest, his piercing gaze fixed on me. His tone carried more than urgency. There was a subtle challenge, a reminder of where he thought my loyalties should lie. Marcus's head snapped toward Jeremy, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any words. I hesitated, caught in the tension between them. "I'll be there in a moment," I called back, trying to steady my voice. Jeremy huffed, his lips curving into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes.
Don't take too long, Queen. We have a kingdom to secure.
He turned on his heel and strode away, his presence leaving a heavy weight in the air. I helped Marcus into the fortress, his body heavy against mine, his silence even heavier. Once inside, I guided him to the bed and gently laid him down. His breaths were shallow, his gaze fixed on the wall as if I didn't exist. I couldn't stop myself from tending to his wounds. Grabbing a cloth and some water, I started cleaning the gashes on his arms, my fingers moving with a tenderness I couldn't suppress. He didn't flinch, didn't even glance my way. The anger in his silence was louder than words. "Marcus," I started softly, hoping to bridge the chasm between us. "I didn't mean—"
Don't.
He cut me off, his voice low but sharp. He still refused to look at me. I sighed, biting back the words that sat heavy on my tongue. After a long, aching silence, I stood, ready to leave him to his thoughts. But just as I turned toward the door, his hand shot out, gripping my wrist. The suddenness of it made me stumble, and before I could catch myself, I landed half against him.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to grab you so hard.
He murmured. His hands instinctively steadied me, one settling at my waist and pulling me closer. "Marcus," I whispered, panic and confusion lacing my tone. "What are you doing? Let me go." I squirmed against his hold, but he didn't loosen his grip. His eyes locked on mine, an intensity in them that made my chest tighten.
Jill,
He said, his voice strained.
don't you remember anything?
A strange sensation flickered in the back of my mind, like a flash of light in a dark room. For a split second, it felt familiar. This closeness, his touch. But the memory was just out of reach. "What are you talking about, Marcus?" I asked, forcing a faint smile to mask the unease creeping into my chest.
Please, Jill, think. Put pressure on your mind. Try to remember.
He urged, his tone bordering on desperation. I tried, I really did, but no matter how hard I pushed, nothing surfaced. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice firmer now. "Let me go." Now. His hand loosened immediately, falling back to the bed with a soft thud. Without another word, I turned and bolted out of the room, and I didn't stop running until I was far enough away that the air felt lighter, though my thoughts didn't. What was he trying to make me remember? The days flew. Jeremy had inserted himself into every corner of my day, offering strategies to grow our realm and care for our people. His energy was unyielding, his loyalty to the cause was undeniable. And though he wasn't always easy to tolerate, Marcus, on the other hand, had grown distant. He still cared for me in his quiet, protective way, ensuring my meals were eaten, my steps were steady. But the moment Jeremy entered the room, Marcus would vanish. His hazel eyes, once so warm, now burned with a jealousy that was impossible to miss. I couldn't focus on these tangled emotions for long. The kingdom needed me. Whenever I could, I'd visit my brother in the prison to make sure he was treated fairly. Seeing him behind bars broke something inside me every time, but duty required sacrifices, and we both knew that. Today, though, the weight of responsibility felt heavier. The date of the examination had finally been announced, and Jeremy insisted we prepare together. We were in the study, surrounded by books and maps, candles casting a soft golden glow across the room.
I don't think Marcus is right for our kingdom.
Jeremy said, his voice steady but laced with intent. I couldn't help but laugh. "And why's that?" Jeremy leaned in slightly, his eyes sharp.
He's been taking advantage of you, Jill. Think about it. If you're his, he gains control. He becomes king. Maybe that's why he's been so close to you from the very beginning. And you think he's some noble protector, don't you?
The room fell into a heavy silence, each of us lost in our own spiraling thoughts. After a long pause, Jeremy broke the quiet, his tone softer now.
Jill,
He said, almost wistfully.
I'm becoming a loyal man, you know.
I looked up from my notes, quirking an eyebrow. "Oh, really? And what brought about this transformation?" He leaned closer, a playful smirk tugging at his lips.
It's you, Jill. I never thought I could overcome my past, but now I've stopped seeing other women. My heart's decided. It belongs to you.
I laughed, shaking my head.
I mean it, Jill.
He said seriously.
You've changed me.
The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and before I could respond, he stood pulling me into his arms.
Let me show you.
He whispered, his lips brushing against my ear. Before I could process what was happening, his lips brushed against mine. It wasn't unpleasant, but it didn't feel right either. I closed my eyes and Marcus's face flashed. I opened it to shrug it off. His lips sought mine, his hands trailing along the edges of my dress. And then, like a thunderclap, the door flew open.
Get your hands off her.
Marcus's voice was a growl, low and lethal. He stormed into the room, his towering frame radiating fury. Before I could blink, he grabbed Jeremy by the collar and yanked him away from me, tossing him across the room like a rag doll.
How dare you touch her?
Marcus spat, his hazel eyes blazing with rage. Jeremy staggered to his feet, his own anger igniting.
She's not yours, Marcus. You don't get to decide.
The two men collided, fists flying in a blur of raw emotion. The air crackled with tension, their shouts echoing through the stone walls. I tried to stand, to scream for them to stop, but my head spun, the room tilting dangerously. "Stop it," I whispered, my voice lost in the chaos. Marcus landed a solid punch, sending Jeremy stumbling back.
She's mine.
He growled, his voice breaking.
She always has been.
Jeremy wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes narrowing.
If she's yours, then why is she here with me? Why did she let me—
Suddenly my vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was Marcus's face, his expression shifting from fury to fear as he caught me in his arms. When I woke, I saw a doctor standing beside me, looking concerned.
"Easy there, Jill,"
a voice said, soft but firm. I looked at Jeremy. A fire burned in his eyes, and it made me instinctively sit up straighter, suddenly aware of the situation. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaky. My heart thudded, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong. The doctor hesitated for a moment, glancing between Jeremy and me before speaking again.
"Jill, you're going to be a mother."
The words hit me like a blow. I couldn't breathe. How? How could this be possible? Jeremy was silent, his jaw clenched. He looked betrayed and hurt. His emotions were as tangled as mine. I started. "But doctor, we didn't."
Yes, you didn't. With Jeremy.
Marcus's voice cut through. He stood in the doorway, his posture straight, yet there was an unmistakable softness in his eyes. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet joy that tugged at the corners of his lips as he spoke.
I am the father of this child, doctor. What precautions do I need to take for my wife?
The doctor, who had been silent until now, cleared throat softly, breaking the moment.
"We'll discuss everything you need to do, of course, but you must both take things slow, Jill especially."
She added quietly before turning to the medical chart. When she left, Marcus turned towards me, his arms already reaching out, eager to wrap me in his embrace. The joy in his eyes, the way he moved towards me, felt like a promise. Something genuine, something safe. But I couldn't allow myself to believe in it. In that moment, Jeremy's earlier whispers about Marcus resurfaced, fueling the simmering anger already burning inside me. Before his arms could fully encircle me, I pushed him away, the action sharp and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest, my gaze turned cold, piercing as I looked up at Marcus. The warmth in his eyes, the hope I had seen just moments ago, was now met with the full force of my hatred, a searing resentment I couldn't hide. "Don't touch me," I spat, my voice trembling with the anger I could barely control.
What happened, Jill?
His voice was calm, his voice gentle but laced with a question that felt too innocent. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and I stood up too quickly, the room spinning around me. "How could you take advantage of me, Marcus?" I whispered almost to myself. Marcus stepped forward, his voice pleading.
No, Jill, I didn't. Trust me, please.
I shook my head, backing away from him. "You did it without my consent, didn't you?" My words felt sharp, like a knife twisting in the air between us. His eyes flickered with sadness, his body tense as if I had struck him. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, and it was almost enough to break me. Just as I was about to turn away, Jeremy stepped forward, his voice full of fury.
How could you even think about it, Marcus?
Marcus turned to face Jeremy, his eyes hardening. Then he looked back at me, his expression full of hurt and frustration.
Jill, you're getting me wrong. I did nothing without your consent. I can prove it.
I stared at him, my chest heaving with emotion. "Prove it," I demanded. Marcus's hand reached out, and before I knew it, he was holding my hand. There on my ring finger was a ring, small, simple, with an M carved into it.
This is the proof, Jill.
He said softly.
I swear it wasn't without your consent.
I felt a lump rise in my throat. The ring, his ring, was proof, wasn't it? His eyes were full of truth. I wanted to believe him, but the pain, the anger, clouded my judgment. If it's so, then consider it a mistake. My voice was cold, but my heart was breaking. I quickly slid the ring off my finger and handed it back to him. Take it back, Marcus. Before I could take another breath, Jeremy's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus by the collar.
You've ruined everything for us, Marcus. Apologize to her now.
Marcus didn't flinch. He just shrugged Jeremy's hand off and turned to me.
I'm not sorry.
He said.
I didn't do anything wrong. I've loved you, Jill, and I'm not sorry for that.
With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, breathless and broken. Jeremy's arms wrapped around me in an instant. I stumbled, my knees giving out, and before I knew it, I was on the floor, tears spilling down my face. The weight of everything hit me at once. Jeremy's anger, the confusion, the heartbreak. But even as Jeremy held me, something inside me, something raw, still longed for Marcus. The days passed like fleeting whispers, carrying a life that wasn't just mine anymore. Every moment felt like it demanded more from me than I could give. This particular evening, I was sitting on the couch in the study, my legs aching and swollen. Jeremy handed me the medicine he always kept ready for my swollen legs and aching back. I took it without a word and retreated to bed, exhaustion claiming me almost immediately. A sharp but soothing sensation stirred me awake, a hand gently massaging my swollen legs. I knew it wasn't Jeremy, he never did anything like this, and I opened my eyes. Marcus. He knelt by the bed, his strong hands moving carefully over my legs, his head bowed, tears slipped down his face, catching the faint light of the room. His broad shoulders, usually so imposing, seemed smaller now, burdened with something I couldn't quite name. Marcus, I whispered, startled, trying to sit up. He looked up at me, his hazel eyes shimmering with emotion, and gently pressed a finger to my lips.
Shh.
He murmured.
Let me.
I froze as he continued, his hands steady but his voice trembling.
I can't watch you suffer like this.
His words broke something in me. I remembered everything, how I had treated him, the venom in my words each time I pushed him away, the way I had slipped off the ring he gave me as if it meant nothing, the bond strained by the cost of the spell, misunderstandings and Jeremy's whispers. And yet, here he was, kneeling before me, unable to stand the sight of me in pain. He was the father of my child, and his vulnerability was undeniable.
You're the mother of my child, Jill.
Marcus said, his voice low and almost trembling.
Please let me take care of you, of both of you. I swear, once our child is born, I'll release you from any bond to me. Just tell me, will you let me be here for you until then?
Yes, I whispered, the word slipping out before I could stop it. He looked at me, startled, as if he hadn't dared to hope for my answer. I reached out, wiping the tears from his face with trembling fingers. His hand found mine, rough and warm, and he pulled me closer. The distance between us dissolved in that moment, replaced by something deeper, something unshakable. The past few days had felt like a dream, or maybe a storm. Marcus had been unwavering, doting on me in ways that left me both comforted and confused. He would massage my legs when the swelling became unbearable, smooth my hair when headaches kept me restless, and even feed me when I was too tired to lift a spoon. His presence was constant, steady like the sun rising each morning. But no matter how much he did for me, no matter how much his quiet devotion warmed something deep inside me, I couldn't shake the invisible thread that pulled me toward Jeremy. Jeremy didn't hide his feelings. He hated the growing closeness between Marcus and me. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened whenever Marcus was near, in the sharp glances he threw our way.
I don't like it, Jill. When will it end?
He asked one evening, leaning against the doorframe as I rested on the couch. What will end? I asked.
Every time I try to talk to you, he's there. Every time I look at you, you're looking at him. When will it end?
I sighed, rubbing my temple. Jeremy, he's the father of my child. Once the baby's born, he'll leave. I've already told you that.
You really think he'll just walk away?
His voice was bitter, edged with jealousy. Yes, he promised, I said firmly. Jeremy stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded and left without another word. The delivery day came suddenly like a storm breaking through a clear sky. One moment, I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to ignore the persistent ache in my back. The next, a sharp, unbearable pain shot through me, doubling me over. "Marcus!" I gasped, clutching the edge of the table. He was by my side in an instant, his arms wrapping around me protectively.
Jill, I think it's time.
He swept me into his arms, his warmth grounding me against the pain, and carried me to the car. Jeremy appeared, his face pale with worry.
I'm coming too.
He said, climbing into the back seat. Marcus didn't argue as he focused on getting us to the hospital. The ride was a blur of pain and tension. Marcus held my hand tightly, his thumb brushing soothing circles over my knuckles. Jeremy kept glancing at Marcus, his fists clenched, while Marcus focused on the road, his jaw set tight. At the hospital, Marcus carried me inside, his hold unwavering. I clung to him, my fingers digging into his shirt as another wave of pain hit. The delivery was agony, but Marcus never let go of my hand. His grip was firm, his whispered reassurances keeping me anchored. Jeremy paced outside the room, his nervous energy radiating through the closed door.
You're strong, Jill.
He whispered.
See, you're doing so well.
He said, his voice breaking slightly. When the cry of our baby girl finally filled the room, the world seemed to pause. The pain, the exhaustion, everything faded as I looked at her for the first time.
She's perfect.
Marcus said, his eyes shining as he cradled her tiny form in his arms. He looked at me, a soft smile spreading across his face.
She looks just like you, see? My little Jill.
I laughed weakly, tears slipping down my cheeks. She's beautiful. Marcus sat beside me, carefully placing our daughter in my arms. For a moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. Just the three of us, wrapped in a fragile bubble of peace. But then, Marcus took my hand in his grip gentle but firm.
As I promised,
He began, his voice heavy.
once our child is born, I will free you from all of my bonds.
His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stared at him, unable to speak.
Promise me
He said softly.
that you'll be happy with Jeremy.
I couldn't meet his gaze. I looked away. Marcus didn't wait for an answer. He gently lifted our daughter from my arms, cradling her as though she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world, wrapping her in a soft blanket. "Marcus," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "Where are you taking her?" He looked at me, his expression a mix of sorrow and determination.
I promise to free you from all bonds, Jill. Little Jill is a bond too. You'll live happily without me, but I won't survive without her. She's the only reason I'll keep going.
His words shattered something inside me. I reached out, but he caught my hand, his touch warm and steady.
I forgive you.
He said softly, his voice thick with emotion.
Every ache you left in my soul, I forgive you. For every tear that fell because of you, I forgive you. For the hurt, the betrayal, the emptiness, I forgive you. I forgive you for leaving me behind, for wiping me from your heart as if I was nothing. Even though I know it wasn't all your fault, it doesn't make the pain any less real. But above all, I forgive you for making me believe I never truly mattered to you.
Tears streamed down my face as he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead.
I will always love you, Jill.
And then he slowly started to walk away, his head high, shoulders trembling, carrying our daughter with him. "Marcus, please don't do this." I tried to get up from bed, but I couldn't. I broke down, sobs racking my body. Watching Marcus walk away felt like he was ripping a part of me out, a piece I'd never get back, no matter how hard I tried to hold on. Jeremy slipped into the room, his arms wrapping around me as I cried into his chest.
It's over now, Jill. Finally, he is gone.
He murmured, his voice soothing, but as he held me, I noticed the flicker of a smile tugging at his lips, a quiet satisfaction as he watched Marcus disappear into the night.